Imagine someone who, over the course of a few months, stops responding to messages, not just from one person, from everyone. Her mom, her college roommate, the group chat she had been part of for 6 years. One by one, the conversations just stopped. No argument, no crisis. She simply stepped back, and when it was done, she didn't feel sad about it. She felt relieved. Now here's the question worth sitting with. Was that relief a sign of something healthy? Or was it the beginning of something quietly damaging? That question is exactly what we are going to explore today. We are going to look at social withdrawal, not shyness, not introversion, not the need for a quiet weekend, but the deeper pattern where a person begins pulling back from the social world, slowly, consistently, until the distance stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like the only comfortable way to exist. What makes this topic genuinely worth studying is that the research does not give us a clean answer. Two substantial bodies of scientific literature look at the same behavior and reach very different conclusions. So today we are going to examine both sides. The evidence that withdrawal causes serious harm, and the evidence that suggests we may be misreading what withdrawal actually is in certain people. Let's start with what the data says about the risks. One of the most important starting points is a large-scale longitudinal study that followed young adults over 3 years. Researchers tracked social isolation alongside mental health outcomes and found what is called a dose-response relationship, meaning the longer the isolation continued, the more significant the psychological impact became. For males, sustained social isolation roughly doubled the odds of developing depressive symptoms. For females, it nearly tripled them. And in the most severe cases, those involving 3 or more years of consistent withdrawal, the odds ratio reached 6.82. That number is worth pausing on. An odds ratio of 6.82 means that individuals with prolonged isolation were nearly 7 times more likely to experience serious depressive symptoms compared to their non-isolated peers. This is not a minor correlation. This is a strong, measurable longitudinal relationship. But the evidence goes beyond mental health outcomes. Neuroimaging research from the University of Chicago has shown that prolonged isolation produces structural changes in the brain itself. The hippocampus, the region most responsible for memory consolidation and emotional regulation, shows measurable shrinkage in chronically isolated individuals. The functional connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, which is essentially the brain's internal system for managing emotional responses and calming itself down, that connection weakens. What this means practically is that when a person who has been isolated for an extended period attempts to re-engage socially, their brain is biologically less prepared to handle those interactions. The anxiety and discomfort they feel in social situations is not simply a personality trait or a lack of willpower. It is the neurological consequence of sustained disconnection. There is another dimension to this that the research captures clearly. A significant amount of withdrawal does not begin as a preference. It begins as a response to being excluded. One study found that the experience of ostracism predicted subsequent withdrawal with a beta coefficient of 0.63. In practical terms, that means being socially excluded is one of the single strongest predictors we have of a person choosing to withdraw from social contact afterward. The mechanism here is important to understand. When someone is excluded, whether at school, at work, or in a personal relationship, their nervous system registers that experience as a threat signal. It stores the information that social environments are potentially dangerous, and future decisions get filtered through that stored experience, often without the person being fully aware of it. Researchers who developed the social withdrawal scale, a validated clinical tool used in treatment settings, identified a particularly significant pattern in high scorers. These individuals rarely socialized, which is expected, but they also almost never confided in anyone. Not because they lacked inner lives, but because over time their inner life had been constructed entirely in private. And once that gap between the internal and the shared grows large enough, re-entering feels nearly impossible. Now let's look at the other side of the research, because it raises genuinely important questions about how we have been defining and interpreting withdrawal. Scientists studying social withdrawal have identified that it is not a single uniform behavior. It is a category that contains meaningfully different subtypes, and those subtypes have very different profiles and outcomes. The first is shy withdrawal. This occurs when a person wants social connection but experiences anxiety that prevents them from reaching for it. This subtype is consistently associated with loneliness and emotional distress. The person is not choosing solitude, they are being kept from connection by fear. The second is avoidant withdrawal. This is driven primarily by fear of rejection rather than general social anxiety. Research shows this subtype carries the highest levels of social anxiety among all withdrawal categories. Again, the person typically wants connection but is paralyzed by the anticipated consequences of seeking it. The third subtype is what researchers call unsociable withdrawal, and this one changes the picture significantly. Unsociable withdrawal describes individuals who have a genuine, stable preference for solitude, not because social environments feel threatening, not because they have experienced rejection or trauma, but because they are simply satisfied with less social contact. When researchers compared unsociable withdrawers to non-withdrawn peers across standard well-being measures, the differences were small. These individuals were not showing the clinical distress patterns, the anxiety profiles, or the depression markers that characterize the other subtypes. This is a critical distinction, because if we treat all withdrawal as though it belongs to the most harmful category, we risk misidentifying people who are functioning well and applying interventions that are not appropriate for their actual experience. There's also an evolutionary perspective worth considering. Human communities throughout history have always required a range of cognitive and behavioral profiles. In a group of 150 people, which is roughly the size of ancient human social units, you needed individuals who were highly socially engaged. But you also needed individuals who were comfortable on the periphery, who could observe quietly, sustain focused attention alone, and think carefully without requiring constant social input. That preference for solitude was not a deficit in the group's functioning. It may well have been essential to it. To understand what withdrawal can look like when it becomes a clinical concern, consider this composite profile drawn from research literature. A 24-year-old man, highly capable professionally, maintains contact with only 2 people on a regular basis. His withdrawal began during a period of accumulated stress, a job transition, the end of a significant relationship, and a form of shame that did not have a clean or easily articulated narrative. The pressure built gradually, and then one day he noticed he had not contacted anyone in 3 weeks, and it had not registered as unusual. This pattern is described in the hikikomori literature, a term originating in Japanese research that now appears across international clinical contexts, referring to extreme social withdrawal that develops not as an innate personality trait, but as the end result of a compounding coping failure. Stress accumulates. Social interactions that go unpracticed begin to feel increasingly foreign. Depression makes the idea of reaching out feel overwhelming, and the withdrawal that began as a way to manage distress begins generating more distress, which makes further withdrawal feel more necessary. That loop is important to understand because it illustrates how a coping behavior can transform into a maintaining factor for the very problem it was meant to solve. Research conducted during COVID-19 lockdowns observed this pattern in real time. Individuals who adopted social withdrawal as their primary coping strategy during that period, not individuals who were already withdrawn, but those who turned to it as a new response to stress, showed measurable increases in social dysfunction over the longitudinal follow-up period. The strategy did not protect them, it worsened the outcome it was meant to prevent. There is one more clinical distinction worth understanding here, because it affects everything about how we interpret withdrawal from the outside. Within clinical psychology, avoidant personality disorder and schizoid personality disorder can both present to observers as social withdrawal, keeps to himself, doesn't engage with others, but internally, these are entirely different experiences. Avoidant personality involves a deep desire for connection combined with an equally deep fear of rejection. Schizoid personality involves genuine indifference to social connection. The external presentation can look identical. The internal experience and the appropriate clinical response could not be more different. So what does the full body of evidence actually tell us? Social withdrawal is not one thing. It is a category that contains meaningfully different patterns, driven by different causes, associated with different outcomes and requiring different responses. The shy adolescent who withdraws from peers is not simply demonstrating a personality type. Longitudinal research shows this pattern is associated with reduced capacity for intimacy in adulthood, including difficulties with romantic closeness and interpersonal trust. These outcomes are not inevitable, but they are consistent enough in the data that they warrant attention and early support. The unsociable individual who recharges through solitude and maintains stable well-being is not a clinical concern. The research is fairly clear on this. Pathologizing a preference for solitude in someone who is functioning well does not reflect what the data actually shows. And the person who used to call every week, who used to be present in the lives of people they cared about, and who has gradually gone quiet in a way they cannot fully articulate. That person's brain is doing something neurologically predictable. It is applying a protective response that was learned in a specific context to a present situation where that context may no longer apply. The withdrawal made sense at some point. The challenge is that it carries its own long-term costs. The hippocampus, to return to the neuroscience, does not distinguish between I'm choosing temporary solitude and I'm in sustained isolation. It responds to the level of social input it receives, and its structure changes accordingly. What the research consistently points toward is not a universal prescription for how much social contact people should have. It points towards something more nuanced. We need to stop treating all quiet as the same quiet. We need to distinguish between the person who has always preferred fewer connections and is well, and the person who once had connections and has gradually let them go. Between the person whose solitude is a source of restoration and the person whose solitude has become a place they cannot leave. Clinical tools help, diagnostic frameworks help, but what the literature returns to, across study after study, is something deceptively simple, someone paying attention. Someone asking not why have you been so distant, but genuinely asking what is actually going on with you. Because social withdrawal is not always the problem. Very often, it is simply the most visible sign that a problem exists somewhere underneath. The evidence is on the table, both sides of it. What conclusion do you draw?